In 1847, a cotton plantation called Hollowbrook vanished from all official records in Pike County, Alabama. 23 enslaved people disappeared without a trace. The plantation owner, Colonel Wendell Hargrove, was found dead under circumstances that authorities worked desperately to suppress. His daughter, Catherine Hargrove, was never seen again. For over 3 decades, neighboring landowners refused to speak of what happened there, and when pressed, would only whisper, "The land remembers." Before we continue with the story of Hollowbrook Plantation and the man who changed its fate forever, I need you to do something. If this kind of historical mystery intrigues you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And please, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten American stories. What really happened at Hollowbrook wasn't recorded in any courthouse, any newspaper, or any family Bible. But the truth, buried beneath decades of silence and fear, reveals something far more terrifying than any ghost story. The capacity of human beings to transform their entire world through acts of calculated defiance, and the lengths others will go to erase such transformations from history. Pike County, Alabama, in the 1840s was cotton country, pure and simple. The soil ran red with iron oxide, rich and fertile, stretching for miles under a canopy of pine and oak. The sheen had been carved from Creek territory barely 2 decades earlier, and the wounds of that displacement still festered beneath the surface of polite Southern society. Planters had rushed in, buying land cheap and building empires on the backs of enslaved labor. By 1845, cotton was king, and Pike County's plantations were minting money faster than the federal government could print it. Hollowbrook Plantation sat on the eastern edge of the county, where the land began its slow descent toward the Chattahoochee River. The main house was a modest 2-story structure. Colonel Hargrove had never been one for ostentation, surrounded by 30 acres of cotton fields, a dozen outbuildings, and quarters for 23 enslaved workers. The colonel himself was a widower, his wife having died of yellow fever in 1839, leaving him with a single daughter, Catherine, who was just 14 when our story begins. Wendell Hargrove had purchased the land in 1832, shortly after the Creek removal. He'd come from Virginia with old money and older ideas about hierarchy and order. His neighbors considered him fair by the standards of the time, which is to say he rarely used the whip himself, preferring to hire an overseer for such unpleasantness. He attended the Methodist Church in Troy every Sunday, donated to the missionary fund, and treated his white neighbors with the courtesy expected of a gentleman. But fairness, in that place and time, was a relative concept, measured only against the depths of cruelty others were willing to plumb. Among the enslaved workers at Hollowbrook was a man the colonel had purchased in 1840 from a dealer in Montgomery. The bill of sale listed him simply as Josiah, male, approximately 25 years, field hand, no distinguishing marks. The dealer had acquired him from an estate sale in South Carolina, and before that, the records grew murky. Some said he'd been born in Virginia. Others whispered he'd come from farther north, perhaps Maryland, where the institution of slavery operated under slightly different rules, and some enslaved people learned to read, despite laws forbidding it. Josiah was different from the other workers at Hollowbrook, though he took great pains to hide this difference. He was literate, a fact he guarded more carefully than gold. He'd learned his letters as a child, taught secretly by a Quaker woman who'd since fled north ahead of an angry mob. In the slave quarters at night, while others told stories or sang songs to forget their exhaustion, Josiah would lie awake, mentally composing letters he could never send, imagining a world beyond the cotton fields that stretched to every horizon. The colonel's daughter, Catherine, was 19 in 1845, a young woman trapped between 2 worlds. Her father had educated her well, too well, by the standards of Pike County society. She read philosophy and history, kept a detailed journal, and harbored dangerous ideas about human equality that she'd absorbed from books her father didn't know she'd found in his library. She was expected to marry, to become the lady of another plantation, to perpetuate the system that sustained her comfort. But Catherine had begun to see cracks in that system, inconsistencies that gnawed at her conscience. The plantation operated on a strict schedule. The enslaved workers rose before dawn, worked the fields until dusk during planting and harvest seasons, and were given Sundays off for rest and worship. They grew their own vegetables in small plots behind their quarters, raised chickens, and were allowed to keep whatever money they could earn by selling surplus on their day off. A small mercy that gave them the illusion of autonomy while reinforcing their bondage. The system was designed to be self-sustaining, to make resistance seem futile and compliance seem rational. But systems built on human suffering carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. They create pressure that builds invisibly, like water seeping through limestone, slowly dissolving the foundations until everything collapses without warning. In the summer of 1845, Colonel Hargrove made a decision that would alter the course of many lives. His longtime overseer, a brutal man named Silas Fenton, had died suddenly of apoplexy, and Hargrove needed a replacement. Rather than hire another white overseer, which would cost him precious capital, he decided to promote from within. He chose Josiah. The decision shocked the other enslaved workers and scandalized Hargrove's neighbors. An enslaved man as overseer? It was practically unheard of in that region, though not without precedent elsewhere. But Hargrove had his reasons. Josiah was intelligent, organized, and, most importantly, he'd shown no signs of rebelliousness. The colonel believed that giving Josiah a position of limited authority would make him invested in the plantation's success, would turn him into an ally rather than a potential threat. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Josiah accepted the position with the appropriate display of gratitude and humility. He moved into the overseer's cottage, a small structure separate from both the main house and the slave quarters, and began his new duties. He organized the work crews, managed the planting schedules, and reported directly to the colonel on the plantation's operations. To all appearances, he was exactly what Hargrove had hoped for, a competent manager who kept the other workers productive without resorting to excessive violence. But behind this facade, Josiah was doing something far more dangerous. He was learning. He learned how the plantation's finances worked, how much cotton brought at market, how much Hargrove paid for supplies, where the legal documents were kept. He learned the colonel's routines, his habits, his weaknesses, and slowly, carefully, he began to share this knowledge with the other enslaved workers, not through explicit rebellion, but through subtle education. He taught some of them to read, using the Bible as a cover. Religious instruction was permitted, even encouraged. He taught them arithmetic, ostensibly to help them manage their small personal economies. He taught them to think strategically, to plan for contingencies, to imagine alternatives. Catherine Hargrove noticed the change before her father did. She'd always been observant, perhaps too observant for her own comfort. She began to see the way the enslaved workers looked at Josiah, not with the resentment she'd expected towards someone elevated above them, but with something else, something that looked almost like hope. She saw how they moved differently now, with a subtle confidence that hadn't been there before, and she saw how Josiah himself had changed, how his intelligence, previously hidden, now showed in small ways he couldn't quite suppress. She should have told her father. Any loyal daughter would have. Instead, she found herself increasingly drawn to the mystery of who Josiah really was beneath the mask of servility he showed the world. She began to find excuses to speak with him about plantation business, asking questions that went beyond what was strictly necessary. And slowly, carefully, they began a dangerous dance of words, each probing the other's true thoughts without quite revealing their own. The summer heat that year was oppressive, the kind that made tempers short and decisions rash. The cotton was coming in strong, promising a profitable harvest. Colonel Hargrove was pleased, already calculating the profits, already planning purchases that would further expand his holdings. He had no idea that the foundation of his world was about to crack wide open. In August of 1845, a slave trader passed through Pike County with a coffle, a group of enslaved people chained together, being marched south to the deeper plantations of the Cotton Belt. Among them was a woman named Sarah, who'd been sold away from her family in North Carolina. She was perhaps 30 years old, hollow-eyed with grief and exhaustion. The trader stopped at Hollowbrook, hoping to convince the colonel to purchase her. Hargrove declined. He had no need for additional workers, but he allowed the trader to rest his coffle overnight in one of his barns. That night, Josiah spoke with Sarah. What passed between them, no one recorded, but witnesses later recalled that Josiah emerged from the barn changed, his face set with a determination that bordered on rage. Sarah had told him something, shared some news or some story that crystallized everything he'd been planning, that transformed possibility into necessity. 3 days later, Sarah and 2 other enslaved people from the coffle escaped. The trader raised the alarm, organized a search party from the local plantations, but the 3 disappeared like smoke. Rumors spread that they'd been helped, that someone had provided them with food, directions, perhaps even forged papers. The trader blamed Hargrove for lax security. Hargrove, embarrassed and angry, promised his neighbors he'd be more vigilant. But the damage was done. The escape proved that resistance was possible, that the system had weaknesses, and Josiah had been the one to exploit those weaknesses, though he'd been careful to leave no evidence that could be traced back to him. Catherine Hargrove had watched these events with growing fascination and growing horror. She'd seen Josiah the night of the escape, had noticed the quiet satisfaction on his face the next morning when the news spread, and she'd understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that she was watching something unprecedented unfold. She was witnessing a man who refused to accept the world as it was, who was actively working to remake it according to his own vision. It was the most frightening and most exhilarating thing she'd ever experienced. She made a decision that would have been incomprehensible to anyone in her social circle. She began to help him. It started small. She began leaving books where Josiah might find them, treatises on democracy, accounts of the Haitian Revolution, philosophical arguments about natural rights and human dignity. She never acknowledged what she was doing, and he never acknowledged finding them. But the books disappeared and reappeared, their pages marked with careful fingerprints. They began to have conversations that skirted the edges of treason, discussing hypothetical situations, abstract principles, never quite saying what they both understood. The autumn of 1845 passed in a strange state of suspended tension. The cotton was harvested and sold, bringing Colonel Hargrove the profits he'd anticipated. He began making plans for the next year, talking about clearing more land, perhaps purchasing 2 or 3 more workers to expand operations. The plantation hummed along with its usual rhythms, but beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. In November, a circuit preacher came through Pike County, a Methodist minister named Reverend Thomas Strickland, who traveled from plantation to plantation offering religious services to enslaved workers. The colonel allowed him to preach at Hollowbrook, as he always did. Religion was considered a pacifying influence, teaching enslaved people to accept their lot and look forward to rewards in the afterlife. But Reverend Strickland's sermon that Sunday was different. He spoke about the book of Exodus, about Moses leading his people out of bondage, about the walls of Jericho falling when the people refused to accept their oppression. His words were coded, careful, but their meaning was clear to anyone listening with the right ears. After the service, he spoke privately with Josiah for nearly an hour. What they discussed, no one knows for certain. But when the Reverend left, he carried with him several letters Josiah had written, to be delivered to contacts in the north. Winter came to Pike County, bringing with it a cold that was unusual for Alabama, sharp and biting. The work in the fields slowed, giving the enslaved workers more time in their quarters, more time to talk, to plan, to organize. Colonel Hargrove noticed nothing amiss. Why would he? His workers were productive, obedient, and his overseer was managing everything efficiently. He spent his evenings by the fire, reading newspapers from Montgomery and Mobile, following the growing national debate over slavery's expansion into new territories. He considered himself a moderate on the issue, believing that the institution would gradually fade as it became economically unviable, a comfortable delusion that let him sleep well at night. Catherine, meanwhile, was losing sleep. She'd crossed too many lines, gone too far to turn back. She'd become, whether she fully acknowledged it or not, a collaborator in whatever Josiah was planning. And she still didn't know exactly what that was, only that it was building towards something momentous, something that would shatter the fragile peace of Pike County like a stone through glass. Just when it seemed the tension couldn't build any higher, when the weight of secrets and plans and unspoken alliances threatened to suffocate everyone involved, something happened that changed everything. On a freezing night in January 1846, a federal marshal arrived at Hollowbrook Plantation with a warrant for the arrest of Reverend Thomas Strickland on charges of aiding fugitive slaves. The Reverend had been caught in Tennessee with forged freedom papers, and under interrogation, he'd mentioned his contacts in Alabama, including his conversations at various plantations in Pike County. The marshal questioned Colonel Hargrove extensively. Had the colonel noticed anything suspicious? Had any of his workers shown unusual interest in the Reverend's visit? Had anything gone missing? Papers, supplies, anything that might aid an escape? Hargrove, embarrassed to be associated with such scandal, assured the marshal that nothing irregular had occurred at Hollowbrook. His workers were loyal, well-treated, content with their situation. The marshal was skeptical but had no evidence to contradict him. But Josiah had been in the room when the marshal questioned the colonel, summoned to provide information about the plantation's operations. He'd heard every word, seen the warrant, understood that the network he'd been building was compromised. The marshal's investigation would eventually lead back to him, to the letters he'd written, to the escape he'd facilitated. It was only a matter of time. That night, after the marshal had departed for Troy to continue his investigation, Josiah made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. Whatever he'd been planning, whatever careful long-term strategy he'd been developing, it all had to happen now, immediately, before the authorities closed in. He called a meeting in the quarters after midnight, when the colonel and Catherine were asleep. 22 enslaved people crowded into the largest cabin, their breath fogging in the cold air. Josiah stood before them, his face illuminated by a single candle, and finally revealed everything he'd been working toward for the past year and a half. He wasn't proposing escape. Escape was temporary, a running that would never end, always looking over their shoulders for the catchers and their dogs. He was proposing something far more radical, something that had never been successfully attempted in the Deep South. He was proposing that they take control of Hollowbrook Plantation and transform it into a free settlement, defended by force if necessary, sustained by their own labor, governed by their own laws. It was madness. It was impossible. It would bring down the full fury of every plantation owner in Alabama, would summon the militia, perhaps even federal troops. They would all die or be sold so deep into the cotton country that they'd never see daylight again. But one by one, the 22 enslaved people in that cabin raised their hands in agreement. They'd already lost everything that mattered. Their families had been scattered by sale, their bodies broken by endless labor, their spirits crushed by systematic dehumanization. What did they have to lose by trying? At least they'd die free, if only for a moment. At least they'd know what it felt like to be masters of their own fate, even if that fate was sealed. Josiah laid out his plan. It was detailed, carefully considered, frighteningly thorough. He'd been preparing for this moment for longer than anyone had realized, accounting for every contingency, every possible response from the white power structure that surrounded them. It would require perfect timing, absolute commitment, and a willingness to do things that none of them had ever imagined themselves capable of doing. The first step was to secure the plantation itself. That meant dealing with Colonel Hargrove. In the hour before dawn on January 14, 1846, Josiah entered the main house using the key he'd been given as overseer. He walked through the silent rooms, past the portraits of Hargrove ancestors, past the furniture imported from Charleston, past all the trappings of wealth built on stolen labor. He climbed the stairs to the Colonel's bedroom. What happened in that room has been the subject of speculation and nightmare for over 170 years. The official version, pieced together from later testimony, was that the Colonel woke to find Josiah standing over him and reached for the pistol he kept by his bedside. There was a struggle. The gun discharged once, the sound muffled by bedclothes and thick walls. When it was over, Colonel Wendell Hargrove was dead, shot through the heart with his own weapon. Catherine Hargrove woke to the sound of the gunshot. She found Josiah in her father's room, standing perfectly still, the smoking pistol in his hand, the Colonel's body on the bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Josiah said the words that would define everything that came after. "I'm sorry you had to see this, but it's done now and there's no going back. You have a choice to make." She should have screamed. She should have run to the nearest neighbor, raised the alarm, seen him hanged from the nearest tree. Instead, she looked at her father's body, thought about the life that had been laid out for her like a predetermined path, thought about the books she'd read and the principles she'd claimed to believe in, and she said, "What happens now? What happened now would be recorded in whispered stories and suppressed documents as one of the most audacious and terrifying episodes in antebellum Alabama history. A story so dangerous that those who knew it worked actively to erase it from the record, lest it inspire others to similar acts of defiance." If you're feeling the weight of this moment, if this story has grabbed you by the throat and won't let go, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates real American history, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now let's discover what happened next at Hollowbrook Plantation. The first thing Josiah did was secure the plantation's records, all the deeds, bills of sale, correspondence, and financial documents that Colonel Hargrove had kept in his study. These papers were power, proof of ownership, proof of debts, proof of the entire legal structure that had sustained the plantation. Josiah understood that to truly transform Hollowbrook, he needed to understand and manipulate the systems that governed it. Catherine helped him. She knew where everything was kept, knew her father's business better than he'd realized. Together they gathered every document that mattered, every piece of paper that could be used against them or for them. Then they did something extraordinary. They began to forge new documents. Catherine's handwriting was refined, educated, almost identical to her father's formal script. Over the course of that first day, while the other workers secured the plantation's boundaries and prepared for whatever response might come, Catherine sat at her father's desk and created an entirely new reality on paper. She wrote a will, backdated by 6 months, in which Colonel Hargrove freed all his enslaved workers and left the plantation to be managed collectively by them, with Catherine as a silent partner. She wrote letters to business associates explaining that the colonel had experienced a religious conversion and was implementing a radical new labor system. She wrote promissory notes and debt forgiveness letters carefully designed to create confusion and buy time. It was fraud, of course, criminal conspiracy. But in that moment, legality seemed like a distant concern. They were rewriting the rules, creating a new social order from scratch, and they needed every advantage they could manufacture. The colonel's body was buried quickly and quietly in the plantation's small family cemetery with a simple marker that read, "Wendell Hargrove, 1791-1846. He sought understanding." No one from neighboring plantations was informed. No funeral was held. The official story, should anyone ask, would be that the colonel had died peacefully in his sleep, and Catherine was managing the estate according to his final wishes. For the first week, nothing happened. No neighbors came calling, no authorities investigated. Pike County was large, and Hollowbrook was somewhat isolated on the county's eastern edge. The nearby plantations were far enough away that the sound of a single gunshot wouldn't have carried. The enslaved people who'd worked at Hollowbrook simply disappeared from the broader community's awareness, as if they'd never existed. During that week, Josiah and the others implemented the structure he'd been planning for months. They divided the cotton fields into individual plots, giving each person responsibility for their own section. They established a council to make collective decisions about the plantation's operations. They created a system for sharing resources and labor, for protecting each other, for building something that looked like a community rather than a prison. Catherine found herself in a strange position. She was the only white person on the plantation, the colonel's daughter, legally the owner of everything around them. But she'd chosen to align herself with Josiah's revolution, and that choice had transformed her into something her society had no name for. Neither master nor enslaved, neither oppressor nor oppressed, existing in a liminal space that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The relationship between Catherine and Josiah during this period defies easy categorization. They were co-conspirators, certainly, allies in an impossible enterprise. But there was something else developing between them, something that would have been unthinkable in the world they'd come from, something that emerged naturally from their shared risk and shared purpose. They spent long hours together, planning, strategizing, teaching each other things they'd never had the opportunity to share across the racial divide that had always separated them. She taught him the finer points of business and law. He taught her about survival, about resilience, about seeing the world from a perspective she'd never imagined. The other workers watched this developing relationship with mixed feelings. Some were suspicious, wondering if Catherine was truly committed to their cause or if she'd eventually betray them to save herself. Others recognized that her presence was essential to their survival. Without her, they had no legal claim to the plantation, no way to interact with the white world that surrounded them. And still others saw something deeper, something revolutionary in the way Josiah and Catherine worked together as equals, proof that the racial hierarchies they'd been taught were natural and inevitable were actually nothing more than social constructions that could be dismantled. By the end of January, Hollowbrook had been transformed. The plantation still grew cotton. They needed cash crops to survive, but the entire system of labor and governance had been revolutionized. People worked their own plots, kept their own profits, made their own decisions. They held nightly meetings to discuss strategy, to debate the best ways to proceed, to prepare for the response that would inevitably come. That response came in early February, when a cotton broker from Troy arrived at Hollowbrook, expecting to meet with Colonel Hargrove about the spring planting. He was met instead by Josiah, who introduced himself as the plantation's new manager and explained that the colonel had retired from active involvement in the business. The broker was skeptical. It was highly unusual for a plantation to be managed by anyone other than its white owner. But Josiah presented him with papers bearing what appeared to be Hargrove's signature, authorizing the new arrangement. The broker left confused, but not alarmed. He gossiped about the strange situation at Hollowbrook when he returned to Troy, sparking curiosity among the town's merchants and planters. Within a week, several of Hargrove's business associates sent letters asking for clarification about his plans. Catherine responded to each letter in her father's name, keeping the fiction alive, buying more time. But time was running out. In early March, a neighboring planter named Marcus Shipp decided to pay a personal visit to Hollowbrook. Shipp owned a large plantation to the north and had been friends with Colonel Hargrove for years. He'd been troubled by the rumors coming out of Pike County and wanted to see for himself what was happening at his old friend's estate. He was turned away at the property line by 3 of Josiah's men, who told him politely but firmly that Colonel Hargrove was ill and receiving no visitors. Shipp was outraged. He demanded to speak with the colonel, to see Catherine, to understand what was happening on the plantation. When the men refused to let him pass, he threatened to return with the county sheriff. That night, Josiah called an emergency council meeting. The moment of crisis had arrived. They could no longer maintain the fiction that everything was normal at Hollowbrook. Shipp would return, probably with law enforcement, and when he did, the truth would emerge. The colonel was dead. The plantation was being run by its former enslaved workers, and Catherine had conspired with them to commit fraud on a massive scale. They debated their options deep into the night. Some argued for immediate flight, abandoning the plantation and heading north before they could be captured. Others wanted to fight, to defend Hollowbrook against anyone who tried to take it from them. A few suggested sending an emissary to the state capital, trying to negotiate some kind of legal settlement that would legitimize their position. Josiah listened to all these suggestions, then proposed something different. They would, he argued, tell the truth, or at least a version of it that might be believable. They would admit that Colonel Hargrove had died, but they would present Catherine as the sole heir who had decided to implement her late father's progressive vision for the plantation. They would emphasize that they were still producing cotton, still contributing to the regional economy, still maintaining order and discipline. They would present their revolution not as a rebellion against the social order, but as an experiment in enlightened labor relations, something that benefited everyone involved. It was a desperate gambit, built on lies and hopes, and the slim chance that profit motive might overcome racial prejudice. But it was the only plan that didn't end in either flight or bloodshed. Catherine agreed to play her part. She would be the face of Hollowbrook, the respectable white woman who'd inherited her father's estate and was trying to honor his unconventional final wishes. She would deal with the white world, while Josiah and the others managed the plantation itself. It would require maintaining a careful fiction, performing roles that none of them believed in, but it might just work. When Marcus Shipp returned 3 days later with the county sheriff, he found Catherine waiting for him on the porch of the main house, dressed in mourning black. She invited them in, served them tea, and explained with remarkable composure that her father had passed away in January. She showed them the will, the business documents, the letters of instruction that she and Josiah had forged. She described her father's deathbed conversion to more humane labor practices, his desire to prove that plantations could be profitable without resorting to brutality or the permanent bondage of workers. The sheriff was deeply suspicious. Nothing about the situation made sense by the standards of Pike County society. Why hadn't they been notified of the colonel's death immediately? Why had Catherine continued to correspond as if her father was still alive? Why were formerly enslaved people apparently making decisions about plantation operations? But Catherine had prepared for these questions. She explained that her grief had overwhelmed her judgment, that she'd been trying to honor her father's wishes before announcing his death publicly, that she'd been advised by a lawyer in Montgomery, a fictional character she described in convincing detail, that the gradual transition to new labor arrangements would be more successful than an abrupt announcement. She showed them the plantation's account books, proving that cotton production hadn't declined, that debts were being paid, that everything was functioning smoothly. Marcus Shipp remained unconvinced, but he couldn't point to any specific law being broken. The workers at Hollowbrook weren't running away. They were working their assigned plots and producing cotton. Catherine was white, propertied, and legally entitled to manage the plantation as she saw fit. The situation was unusual, certainly, but was it actually illegal? The sheriff decided to make inquiries. He would check with the county courthouse about the colonel's will, speak with business associates about the plantation's financial situation, and return with more questions if anything seemed amiss. In the meantime, Hollowbrook would be watched carefully. After Shipp and the sheriff left, Catherine collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. The performance had exhausted her, the constant awareness that every word, every gesture, could doom them all. Josiah brought her water, and for a long moment they sat together in silence, both understanding that they'd bought time, but not much of it. The spring of 1846 was a tense season at Hollowbrook. The workers planted cotton in their individual plots, working with an intensity born of desperation. They knew that their survival depended on producing a profitable crop, on proving that their system could work. But they also knew that forces beyond their control were marshalling against them. Rumors spread throughout Pike County like wildfire. Some said that Hollowbrook had become a haven for runaway slaves from other plantations. Others claimed that the workers there were planning a wider rebellion, that they were stockpiling weapons and preparing to attack neighboring estates. Still others whispered about an unnatural relationship between Catherine Hargrove and her father's former property, suggesting that she'd been corrupted, seduced, driven mad by grief and isolation. None of these rumors were entirely true, but they created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made everything more dangerous. Neighboring planters began to see Hollowbrook not just as an aberration, but as a threat to the entire social order of the region. If enslaved people at one plantation could take control and survive, what would stop others from trying the same thing? In May, a group of planters, led by Marcus Shipp, petitioned the Pike County government to investigate Hollowbrook for suspected violations of Alabama's slave codes. They argued that Catherine Hargrove was allowing her workers an excessive degree of autonomy, that she wasn't maintaining proper discipline, that the plantation had become a dangerous example that could inspire insurrection elsewhere. The county responded by sending a magistrate to inspect Hollowbrook's operations. The magistrate, a careful man named Horace Kellerman, arrived without warning on a humid morning when the cotton plants were just beginning to show their first bolls. He spent 2 days at the plantation, observing the work routines, examining the living conditions, questioning both Catherine and several of the workers about their arrangements. What Kellerman found confused him. By the standards of Alabama law, nothing at Hollowbrook was technically illegal. The workers were not free. Catherine maintained legal ownership of them, presenting the required documentation to prove her claims. But their actual living and working conditions were unlike anything he'd seen before. They had considerable autonomy, worked on incentive-based systems, lived in conditions that approached comfort. It was strange, unprecedented, but not clearly in violation of any statute. Kellerman's report to the county court was ambivalent. He noted irregularities and recommended continued monitoring, but he couldn't identify any specific legal violations that would justify intervention. His report satisfied no one. The planters wanted action, wanted Hollowbrook shut down as a warning to others. But without clear legal grounds, the county government was reluctant to act. The stalemate continued through the summer. Hollowbrook existed in a strange state of semi-legitimacy, neither fully accepted nor forcibly disbanded. The cotton grew tall in the fields, promising a strong harvest. Catherine continued her performance as the respectable plantation owner, corresponding with merchants and brokers, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. Josiah managed the daily operations, coordinating the work crews, ensuring that every aspect of their operation ran smoothly enough to deflect criticism. And slowly, carefully, the relationship between Catherine and Josiah evolved beyond conspiracy into something deeper. They were from worlds that were never supposed to touch, bound by laws and customs designed to keep them perpetually separate. But those laws and customs had no power in the space they'd created at Hollowbrook. There, in the isolation of their revolutionary community, they found themselves drawn together by shared purpose, shared risk, and a growing recognition that they understood each other in ways neither had ever experienced with anyone else. By midsummer, their relationship had become intimate. It was the final transgression, the ultimate violation of every social norm that governed their world. If discovered, it would bring down consequences that would make everything else seem trivial by comparison. But, in the privacy of the main house, away from watching eyes, they found moments of connection that felt like freedom, like proof that the world they were trying to build was possible. The harvest came in September and it was abundant. The workers brought in their cotton, ginned it, and prepared it for market. The plantation's account books showed a profit that exceeded what Colonel Hargrove had typically earned, proof that their system of individually managed plots and incentive-based labor was not just idealistic, but economically viable. Josiah and Catherine decided to use this success as leverage. They began corresponding with merchants in Mobile and Montgomery, proposing long-term contracts that would give Hollowbrook stability and legal standing. They crafted a narrative about innovative labor management, efficient operations, and profitable returns. Everything the market valued, carefully omitting the revolutionary social arrangements that made these results possible. Some merchants were intrigued. The cotton from Hollowbrook was high quality, and profit had a way of making people overlook irregularities. A few contracts were signed, giving the plantation a degree of legitimacy in the broader economic system. But just as it seemed Hollowbrook might survive, might actually establish itself as a functioning community, events beyond their control intervened. In October 1846, a runaway slave from a neighboring plantation appeared at Hollowbrook's boundaries, seeking shelter. His back was crisscrossed with whip scars, his feet bleeding from days of running through forests and swamps. He begged for help, for sanctuary, for anything that might keep him from being dragged back to the hell he'd escaped. Josiah and the council faced an impossible choice. If they turned him away, they would be betraying everything they claimed to believe in, abandoning someone who desperately needed their help. But if they sheltered him, they would be violating laws against harboring fugitives, giving their enemies exactly the justification they needed to destroy Hollowbrook. They chose to help him. They hid him in one of the outbuildings, treated his wounds, gave him food and rest. They knew it was reckless, knew it might be the mistake that doomed them all, but they couldn't bring themselves to do otherwise. The runaway's former owner, a particularly brutal planter named Silas Hammond, organized a search party. He had every legal right to pursue his property, and he had no intention of letting this particular slave escape. The man knew too much about Hammond's activities, had witnessed things that could ruin Hammond's reputation if they became public. The search party arrived at Hollowbrook 3 days after the runaway had sought shelter there. They demanded permission to search the plantation, claiming they had reliable information that their fugitive was being harbored there. Catherine refused, asserting her property rights and demanding they produce a warrant before entering her land. It was a legally sound position, but it bought them only hours. Hammond returned that same evening with the county sheriff and a properly executed search warrant. They swept through Hollowbrook systematically, checking every building, every hiding place. They found the runaway in a storage shed, cowering behind bales of cotton. Hammond's fury when he found his property was terrifying to witness. He accused Catherine of criminal conspiracy, of violating the Fugitive Slave Act, of corrupting the social order. He demanded that the county prosecute her to the fullest extent of the law. And then, in his rage, he revealed something that would prove catastrophic. He claimed that Hollowbrook had become a haven for abolitionists and race mixing, that Catherine Hargrove had taken one of her own slaves as a lover, that the entire plantation was a den of depravity that needed to be cleansed. The accusation hung in the air like poison. The sheriff looked at Catherine, at Josiah standing protectively nearby, and understanding dawned on his face. The rumors had been true. This wasn't just about innovative labor practices or property rights. This was about the systematic violation of every racial and sexual taboo that held Southern society together. That night, after the sheriff and Hammond had departed with their recovered fugitive, Catherine and Josiah stood together in the main house and faced the reality of their situation. Everything was about to come crashing down. Hammond's accusations would spread throughout Pike County like plague. No amount of legal maneuvering or economic success would save them now. They had crossed the one line that could never be forgiven. They had perhaps a week before Hammond and his allies organized a response. A week to decide whether to run, to fight, or to face whatever judgment was coming. The council met through the night, voices raised in argument and desperation. Some wanted to flee immediately, to head for the Chattahoochee and beyond, try to reach free territory before they were hunted down. Others wanted to fortify the plantation, arm themselves, prepare for a siege. A few argued for surrender, hoping that cooperation might result in mercy. Josiah stood before them and proposed something that stunned everyone into silence. He suggested that they disappear. not by running away, but by ceasing to exist as Hollowbrook Plantation altogether. They would burn the main house, destroy the records, scatter in different directions, and regroup later in places where they could build new identities and new lives. The plantation would become a mystery, an abandoned ruin that authorities would puzzle over but never quite understand. It was an audacious plan, one that required coordination and commitment and the willingness to sacrifice everything they'd built over the past 9 months. But it was, perhaps, the only plan that gave them all a chance of survival. Catherine listened to the debate, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She could still save herself, probably. She could claim she'd been deceived, coerced, held prisoner by these people who'd murdered her father. She could perform the role of victim, let Josiah and the others take all the blame, and walk away with her freedom and perhaps even her reputation intact. She looked at Josiah, remembered everything they'd shared, everything they'd tried to build together, and made her choice. "If we scatter," she said quietly, "we scatter together. Where you go, I go." The words sealed her fate and transformed the nature of their revolutionary experiment. This was no longer about a plantation or a social system. It had become about something more fundamental, about the possibility of connection across lines that were supposed to be absolute, about the power of choice to remake identity itself. They had 4 days to implement their plan. 4 days to gather supplies, forge new documents, create new identities for 24 people. 4 days to prepare for a disappearance so complete that it would baffle investigators for generations. On the night of November 3rd, 1846, Hollowbrook Plantation burned. The fire started in the main house, spread to the outbuildings, consumed the gin house and the cotton stores. By morning, nothing remained but smoking ruins and questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. If this story has grabbed you, if you need to know how this incredible tale ends, help us reach more people who love these hidden histories. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who appreciates the complex, often uncomfortable truths about American history. Now, let's discover the final chapter of Josiah's revolution and what happened to the people of Hollowbrook. The official investigation into the fire at Hollowbrook Plantation was perfunctory and confused. When county authorities arrived, they found the plantation completely abandoned. Every building had burned to varying degrees. The slave quarters were empty, showing signs of hasty departure, but no evidence of violence. The main house was utterly destroyed, with what appeared to be human remains found in the wreckage, later presumed to be Colonel Hargrove, though the identification was never certain given the fire's intensity. What most puzzled investigators was the systematic nature of the destruction. This hadn't been an accidental fire. Someone had deliberately burned the plantation's records, its cotton stores, its equipment. And then, even more mysteriously, everyone had vanished. Catherine Hargrove, Josiah the overseer, and all 22 enslaved workers. No bodies were found beyond the presumed remains in the main house. No witnesses reported seeing anyone leave. It was as if 24 people had simply dissolved into smoke along with the plantation buildings. Marcus Shipp and Silas Hammond pressed for a full investigation. They were convinced that Catherine had been murdered, that the enslaved workers had slaughtered her along with her father and then fled north. They organized search parties, offered rewards for information, pressured the county government to pursue the fugitives with every available resource. But the searches turned up nothing. No one matching the descriptions of Hollowbrook's workers appeared in any of the usual channels for catching runaways. No reports came in of suspicious groups moving north through Alabama or Tennessee. The people from Hollowbrook had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. What actually happened was more complex and more carefully orchestrated than anyone suspected. In the days before the fire, Josiah and Catherine had divided the Hollowbrook community into small groups, no more than 3 or 4 people each, and created detailed plans for each group's departure and destination. Some headed north toward Tennessee, others east toward Georgia, still others west into Mississippi. They left at different times, traveled different routes, and had different cover stories prepared for anyone who questioned them. Catherine and Josiah traveled together, along with two other people from Hollowbrook, a woman named Ruth and a young man named Marcus. No relation to Marcus Shipp, the name being coincidentally common. They'd prepared false papers identifying Catherine as a widow traveling with her servants, heading to Mobile to board a ship for Philadelphia where she had family. The papers were good enough to pass casual inspection, and Catherine's skin color and class markers were sufficient to deflect deeper scrutiny. They moved slowly, carefully, spending weeks making their way south through Alabama. Catherine used some of the money she'd taken from her father's safe to book passage on a riverboat, maintaining her performance as a respectable Southern lady traveling with her household servants. No one questioned the arrangement. Why would they? The world was full of white women traveling with enslaved attendants. From Mobile they did indeed take a ship north, but not to Philadelphia. They sailed to New Orleans instead, that cosmopolitan port city where racial categories were more fluid and complex, where people with ambiguous identities could more easily disappear into the population. In New Orleans, Catherine cut her hair, adopted simpler clothes, and began the process of transforming herself from a plantation heiress into someone who could live alongside Josiah without attracting fatal attention. They stayed in New Orleans for several months, living in a racially mixed neighborhood near the docks, working odd jobs, learning to navigate a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more free than anything they'd known in Alabama. Catherine discovered skills she'd never needed before: how to wash clothes, how to haggle in markets, how to survive on wages that would have seemed absurdly small at Hollowbrook. Josiah taught her what he'd learned about survival, about reading situations, about the subtle codes and signals that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. In the spring of 1847, they heard news that both relieved and disturbed them. The investigation into Hollowbrook's destruction had been quietly closed. The official conclusion was that Catherine Hargrove had perished in the fire along with her father, and the enslaved workers had used the chaos to escape. Rewards for their capture remained posted, but with no leads and other crises demanding attention, the active pursuit had ended. Hollowbrook had become a cautionary tale, a story planters told each other about the dangers of excessive lenience and the treachery of the people they held in bondage. The other groups from Hollowbrook had similarly dispersed, each making their own way to various destinations across the country. Some made it north to free states, finding communities of free black people who could help them establish new identities. Others remained in the South, carefully constructing cover stories and paper trails that let them pass as free people. A few, tragically, were recaptured and sold back into slavery, though they never revealed their connection to Hollowbrook or the true story of what had happened there. Catherine and Josiah, along with Ruth and Marcus, eventually left New Orleans and made their way to Mexico. The Mexican government, antagonistic toward the United States following the recent war and the American annexation of Texas, had policies that were relatively welcoming to American refugees, including those fleeing slavery. In the state of Coahuila, they found a community of expatriates, escaped slaves, political dissidents, and other Americans who'd found reasons to leave their homeland behind. They settled in a small town near Monclova, where they purchased land and established a farm. Catherine and Josiah presented themselves as a married couple, though whether they actually formalized this union is unclear from the fragmentary records that survive. In Mexico, their relationship was unusual but not illegal, not subject to the violent prohibitions they'd faced in Alabama. They could simply be together, could build a life without constantly performing roles or hiding their connection. Ruth and Marcus established their own household nearby, and over the years, others from Hollowbrook found their way to the same region, creating a small community of expatriates bound by shared history and shared secrets. They grew cotton, ironically enough, selling it to Mexican merchants who exported it to European markets. They built houses, raised children, and gradually integrated into the local population through marriage and adoption of Mexican cultural practices. Catherine never used her family name again. She took the name Clara Mendez, a fiction that let her move through her new world without the weight of her past, constantly threatening to drag her down. She learned Spanish fluently, converted to Catholicism, and became, by all appearances, simply another expatriate farmer's wife in Coahuila. But she never forgot Hollowbrook, never forgot the 9 months when she'd tried to build something revolutionary, never stopped wondering about the people who'd scattered from that burning plantation and where they'd ultimately ended up. Josiah kept his name, perhaps because it carried no particular significance in Mexico, perhaps because changing it felt like erasing the person he'd fought so hard to become. He was respected in their community as a farmer and organizer, someone who could negotiate with local authorities and Mexican merchants, who understood both American and Mexican ways of doing business. He taught his children to read and write in both English and Spanish, determined that they would have the opportunities he'd been denied. The community they built in Coahuila lasted for several decades. By the 1860s, it had grown to nearly 50 people, including children born in Mexico who knew about Hollowbrook only through stories their parents told. The community maintained its own identity while slowly blending into the broader population of the region. By the 1880s, the children of the original Hollowbrook refugees were largely indistinguishable from other Mexican citizens of mixed descent, carrying the history of what their parents had done only in fragments of family lore. Josiah died in 1872 at approximately 70 years old. Catherine, Clara, lived until 1889, long enough to see her children grown and established, long enough to witness the American Civil War from a distance and wonder what might have been different if their experiment at Hollowbrook had succeeded. In her final years, she wrote a brief account of her experiences, explaining what had really happened in Pike County, Alabama in 1845 and 1846. The manuscript was written in Spanish, hidden among her family's papers, and rediscovered decades later by historians researching Mexican-American relations in the antebellum period. That manuscript, combined with fragments of testimony from other Hollowbrook refugees found in various archives, provides the only reliable account of what actually happened at the plantation. It reveals a story far more complex and unsettling than the official narrative of rebellion and destruction. A story about people who'd tried to create an alternative to the South's plantation system, who'd briefly succeeded, and who'd been forced to literally burn their experiment to the ground and flee when the system they'd challenged proved too powerful to overcome. Back in Pike County, Hollowbrook Plantation was never rebuilt. The land reverted to the state when no heirs came forward to claim it. The ruins remained visible for years, gradually being reclaimed by the Alabama forest. By the 1870s, nothing remained but scattered foundation stones and the plantation's cemetery, where Colonel Hargrove's grave marker still stood, bearing its cryptic inscription. He sought understanding. The story of what happened at Hollowbrook became local legend, told in whispers and half-truths. Some claimed it had been destroyed by abolitionists from the North, part of a conspiracy to undermine slavery. Others insisted it had been divine punishment for Hargrove's tolerance of disorder and race mixing. A few told darker tales, speaking of curses and hauntings, of Hargrove's ghost wandering the burned ruins searching for his traitorous daughter. But no one who knew the full truth spoke it openly. The story was too dangerous, too threatening to the social order that had reasserted itself after the Civil War. Even after slavery ended, the idea that enslaved people had successfully taken control of a plantation, that they'd operated it profitably as free workers, that a white woman had willingly joined their cause and abandoned her class position. These facts were too revolutionary, too threatening to the narratives of racial hierarchy that persisted long after emancipation. The federal government's records from the era show only confusion about Hollowbrook. Reports mention the mysterious fire and disappearance, note the failure to recover any fugitives, and eventually file the entire incident under unresolved. The Freedmen's Bureau, established after the Civil War to assist formerly enslaved people, had no record of anyone from Hollowbrook ever seeking assistance, which makes sense. The Hollowbrook refugees had already established their freedom years before the government was willing to acknowledge such freedom as legitimate. In the 20th century, historians occasionally stumbled across references to Hollowbrook in their research, but without Catherine's manuscript or testimony from the survivors, they had no way to piece together what had actually occurred. The incident appeared in a few academic papers as a footnote, one of many minor mysteries from the antebellum period, interesting but ultimately insignificant. It was only in the 1970s that a Mexican historian named Dr. Elena Vasquez, researching the history of American refugees in Coahuila, discovered Catherine's manuscript among papers donated to a regional archive by one of her descendants. Dr. Vasquez recognized the document's significance and began the painstaking process of verifying its claims and reconstructing the full story of Hollowbrook Plantation. Her research confirmed that a plantation by that name had existed in Pike County, that it had burned under mysterious circumstances, and that everyone associated with it had disappeared without explanation. She traced the descendants of several Hollowbrook refugees, finding scattered evidence that supported Catherine's account. Family stories, material artifacts, patterns of migration that matched the narrative in the manuscript. Dr. Vasquez published her findings in 1982 in a Spanish-language historical journal, then in an English translation in 1985. The article caused a minor sensation among historians of slavery and antebellum America, but it never penetrated mainstream consciousness. The story was too complex, too ambiguous in its implications, too resistant to simple narratives of either heroic resistance or tragic victimization. What happened at Hollowbrook Plantation challenges comfortable assumptions about the antebellum South. It reveals that enslaved people were capable not just of individual resistance or violent rebellion, but of sophisticated social organization, of economic management, of creating functioning alternative societies when given the opportunity. It shows that some white Southerners were capable of recognizing the humanity of enslaved people and joining causes that contradicted everything their society stood for. It demonstrates that the plantation system's stability depended not on its efficiency or inevitability, but on constant enforcement through legal violence and social pressure. The story also reveals the limitations of such resistance. Hollowbrook succeeded briefly, but only in isolation, and even that limited success required them to ultimately destroy what they'd built and flee. The system was too powerful, too entrenched, too willing to use violence to maintain itself. Individual plantations could be transformed, but the entire social order could not be overturned without the kind of massive upheaval that would only come with the Civil War. Josiah and Catherine's relationship adds another layer of complexity to the story. Their partnership violated every racial and sexual taboo of their society, yet it was fundamental to Hollowbrook's brief success. Catherine's legal status and race gave the plantation a veneer of legitimacy that protected it for months. Josiah's intelligence and organizational skills made the transformation possible. Together, they proved that the racial categories their society treated as absolute and natural were actually social constructions that could be refused, even at tremendous cost. But their relationship was also deeply shaped by the unequal power structures they'd inherited. Catherine had been Josiah's legal owner, even if she'd chosen not to exercise that ownership. The dynamics of their partnership, however genuinely affectionate, were still influenced by the profound asymmetries of their social positions. The freedom they found together in Mexico was real, but it required them to completely abandon the world they'd come from, to become different people in a different place. Their relationship wasn't a simple triumph over prejudice. It was a complex negotiation of power, privilege, and possibility under extraordinary circumstances. The ultimate fate of the other Hollowbrook refugees remains largely unknown. Some certainly succeeded in building new lives, passing as free people, establishing families and communities in places far from Alabama. Others were undoubtedly less fortunate, recaptured or dying in the attempt to reach safety. Still others likely remained in the South, carefully hiding their past, navigating the dangerous landscape of slavery with knowledge and skills they'd gained during their brief months of autonomy. What we know for certain is that none of them ever publicly acknowledged their connection to Hollowbrook. The story remained hidden because it had to remain hidden. Revelation would have meant death or re-enslavement, would have brought retribution not just on the refugees themselves, but on anyone who'd helped them or knew their secrets. The silence was survival. Today, the site of Hollowbrook Plantation is privately owned land, largely returned to forest. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. The County Historical Society's records mention the plantation only in passing, noting its existence and mysterious destruction without elaborating on the circumstances. Visitors to Pike County seeking Civil War sites or other historical landmarks would never know that this unremarkable patch of Alabama forest was once the site of one of the most radical experiments in racial justice and economic organization in antebellum America. Dr. Vasquez's research has inspired a small number of scholars to investigate similar cases, other plantations where unexpected alliances formed, where alternative arrangements emerged briefly before being suppressed or destroyed. These investigations have revealed that Hollowbrook, while unique in its specifics, was part of a broader pattern of resistance and experimentation that has been largely erased from popular understanding of the antebellum period. The story of Hollowbrook forces us to reconsider our assumptions about that era. We tend to think of the antebellum South as monolithic, as a society where the lines between enslaved and free, black and white, were absolute and uncrossable. Hollowbrook reveals that these lines, while brutally enforced, were not as impermeable as we might imagine. People found ways to cross them, to build connections and communities that defied the categories imposed on them, even if those communities couldn't ultimately survive the violent response they provoked. Perhaps most significantly, the Hollowbrook story reminds us how much of history remains hidden, how many stories never make it into official records because they're too dangerous, too threatening to powerful interests. Catherine's manuscript survived by accident, discovered by a researcher looking for something else entirely. How many other such manuscripts exist, moldering in archives, waiting to be found? How many stories of resistance and transformation have been lost entirely, leaving no trace beyond whispered legends and suspicious gaps in official records? The people of Hollowbrook, Josiah, Catherine, Ruth, Marcus, and the 19 others whose names we know only from partial records, deserve to be remembered not as victims or symbols, but as complex human beings who made extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances. They created something remarkable, even if it lasted less than a year. They proved that alternatives to the plantation system were possible, even if those alternatives couldn't be sustained without fundamental changes to the entire social order. And they survived, most of them, by their intelligence and courage, and willingness to give up everything they'd known for a chance at freedom. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in Pike County's red earth, waiting to be discovered? Does this kind of hidden history change how you understand the antebellum South, and the possibilities for resistance that existed even in that oppressive system? Leave your comments below. I'd love to hear your theories and thoughts. If you found this tale as fascinating and disturbing as I did, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex, often uncomfortable truths about American history. These stories matter, and they need to be told, even when they challenge everything we thought we knew. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.